Here we go. Welcome to this live stream. I'm delighted and honored to be tonight with Perry Marshall, and he just asked me how I've been following him, and it's actually a really interesting story, Perry. So before I get into me following your work, I just want to give the viewers a quick introduction into yourself. So um, I like to introduce my guest usually in a different way, simply to try and get up to date with their latest, their works and the way that they're actually thinking about things. So I wanted to introduce you as a natural philosopher, actually. I didn't want to give the standard introduction. And the reason for that is because you have the unique stance in which you've debated Stephen Meyer and also PZ Myers. So, I mean, there's very few people, I think, in this camp, in this discussion between evolution and creationism and atheism and all of these discussions, that has that unique position. And also this particular book, Evolution 2.0, Breaking the Deadlock Between Darwin and Design, was actually lifted up by Dennis Noble at the Royal Society, which is a very unique honor, I would say, because obviously Dennis Noble is Dennis Noble, but also the Royal Society is, of course, where Darwin first proposed his idea. So what I wanted to ask you, Perry, is firstly, how do you feel about the description of yourself as a natural philosopher, as opposed to a businessman and someone who transitioned over to, discussions about evolution and whatnot?
I love it. I am a natural philosopher. That is very accurate. And in fact, I've said often to my business colleagues, like when I talk about the very, very best people in business, the very best people in marketing, the very best people in science, they're all good philosophers, because philosophy is thinking about thinking, and it's being aware of how you think and why you think. And the very best people in any field are aware of these things in a way that the average people in the field are not. And it's why they see different things. It's why they have insights. It's why they have breakthroughs. And usually also the very, very best people in any field read much more widely.
Yeah.
And are interested in lots of strange and interesting things that have nothing to do with whatever they're famous for, or whatever their career is. There's a fantastic book called Range that talks about this. And it makes a great case that, it says for musicians, a musician who can play at least 3 instruments, not even at a virtuoso level, if they're just competent at playing 3 instruments, it makes them a much better musician than a person who only learns the piano and that they couldn't play the flute, or they couldn't play the guitar, or they couldn't play the drums. And so, yeah, I am a natural philosopher. I think that's I think we're off to a great conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And another question I wanted to ask you is the 80-20 principle, which obviously is a best-selling book which you authored.
Yes.
One of the things which I was trying to think to myself, how could Perry go from a field so different to his own and then go in the field, and then someone like Dennis Noble, likens your updated understanding of evolution to that of James Shapiro, who I just interviewed again yesterday. And I was kind of thinking maybe it's because he's taken the 80-20 principle and applied it to, okay, let me not go into the absolute deep waters of what's happening at this micro level. Let me just understand thoroughly the core principles. So, for example, one of the things that I found fascinating is that you may talk about details, but then you'll go to the ontology of substance versus process ontology. You wouldn't just, always have these nuanced discussions. You'd always go from the small picture to the big picture, and then to the small picture and to the big picture. Do you think that's a correct sort of description of your way of thinking?
Yes, I have a friend named Emerson Sparts who He's in his 30s, and a few years ago, he made a bunch of money in cryptocurrency, and he stopped running a company and just started doing whatever he wanted. And whatever he wanted to do was learn about new things. Like, he's a professional learner. He's intensely curious. He said something very interesting to me. So every month or two, he decides to get interested in something else. You know, he might wake up in the morning and go, you know what? I think I want to know about viruses. So I'm just going to study viruses for the next 2 months. I'm going to learn everything I can. And then it might be neuroscience, and then it might be shipbuilding, and then it might be magnetics or something. And he said the most interesting thing. He said, so now that I've done this 10 or 20 times, and I've gone very deep in 10 or 20 fields, I've noticed a pattern. The pattern is I wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to learn about shipbuilding. And then I read, like, okay, who are all the experts on that? And, you know, what are their bios and what do they say? And what book did they read, or what article did they write? And I'll go read that. And he says, usually about 20 hours into researching that field, I will find somebody who teaches me more in 1 hour than the previous 20 people taught me in 20 hours. That's 80-20, by the way, right there. And he says, this person is always what I call an interdisciplinary explainer. That person is expert in not one field, but several. And they've learned how to explain what they know in plain English. And that is a litmus test, because Einstein, everybody knows who Einstein is. Not everybody knows that he would go around and give lectures to high schools and churches and synagogues and anywhere somebody would have him, and he would explain his ideas about quantum idea and speed of light and relativity to regular people, to lay audiences. And he was able to get them to understand what he was talking about. And I believe that if you really know what you're talking about, you can, in any field of expertise, you can explain it in plain English to a high school kid. And so I've really tried to cultivate that. And one of the things, so there's a pattern that I have noticed in evolutionary biology, and I have seen this over and over and over again. And Dennis Noble is an example, and there's a bunch of others. Somebody is in a field outside of evolutionary biology. They come to evolutionary biology and they go, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. They just told me natural selection explains everything. No, natural selection is an outcome. It's not an explanation. They didn't actually tell you how you got an eye or how you got a wing or any of that. They swept it all under the rug. There's got to be a better explanation than that. And then they went into it, and then they all came up with a similar set of conclusions. So this goes back a long way. James Shapiro had that. Well, so let's start with Dennis Noble. He was in physiology, but he said, somebody's going to have to explain this to me in a way that makes sense to physiologists. And he came up with a different set of conclusions. I came to this saying, somebody's going to have to explain this to me as an electrical engineer, because from what I know, what the neo-Darwinists are saying doesn't make any sense. Nothing works this way. I've built a lot of things. I've never seen anything that works the way they say evolution works. John Hands, who wrote Cosmo Sapiens, same thing. Henry Heng, who wrote Genome Chaos and is one of the most brilliant cancer researchers I know, same thing. I can go person after person after person. This happens over and over. And all of these people come to fairly similar conclusions. Bill Miller, radiologist, comes into evolution. And all of us came to the conclusion that evolution is driven by the intelligence of cells and the collective intelligence of organisms, and that intelligence in some way, shape, or form seems to precede life itself. Now, not all of them would say that, but everybody at least believes that life and intelligence both fit hand in glove. And so I said, somebody's going to have to explain something to me that makes sense in plain English. And the evolutionary biologist that first made sense to me was James Shapiro. And then he explained Barbara McClintock, he explained Lynn Margulis, a bunch of other people like that. And all of a sudden I started to get a picture that I think it's a much more accurate understanding of how life works.
Absolutely. And just to speak about having an impact on the field by coming from an outside perspective, Thomas Kuhn came to mind. So he was obviously a physicist, and he came into philosophy and impacted philosophy of science in a way that it's changed forever. Something else to keep in mind is I found a level of intellectual bravery on your part, because you broke away from what you believed previously. And your story with your brother I found really intriguing, because when your brother gave the answer that we know how the hand evolved, he gives the falcon example. Your initial thought is the same thought which I would have or anyone else would have. Well, I'm sure there's a bunch of biologists who know what they're talking about, and they have that way of explaining design. So design is a product of random mutations being selected passively by natural selection. But then you went home and you put on your engineering hat and you said, no, actually, that doesn't make any sense. And you decided to challenge that conclusion. That intellectual bravery, Perry, why is it that most people are not willing to basically challenge those assumptions?
So I think there are a lot of reasons. One reason is it takes courage. When you are part of any community, like all communities have stories. I had an English professor who said the definition of a community is a group of people who share the same stories. Mm-hmm. That's a really good definition. Well, when you're a member of a community and everybody's getting along and everybody's eating the same thing and everybody's doing the same thing on the same day of the week, that's really comfortable. And when you all of a sudden, when you want to stand up and say, hey, everybody, I'm not sure this is right, people get upset, people get angry, people get offended. And so it takes courage just to do that. And then there's a lot of people don't feel that they have the confidence that experts have, or they don't feel they have the toolkit or the knowledge or the intellectual resources to challenge PhDs and established received wisdom, or philosophers or theologians or psychologists or whoever they might be. So there's that. Then there's most people have only gotten good at one or two things, and they don't feel at all adept in going out of their expertise and having the confidence that they have the ability to figure stuff out. Now, I'm an engineer, and as an engineer, I know that I know certain things. The world that I do know works a certain way. I know that if I string resistors and capacitors together, I can get out my calculator. I can tell how many volts and how many amps and how many watts, and it's all exactly right. Electrical engineering is a very exact discipline. And so when I had that conversation with Brian, and he told me a kind of a standard line of evolution, and I said, what I thought to myself was, I've been to 5.5 years of engineering school. I've been out of school now for 10 years. I have built all kinds of things. I have never in my life seen anything work the way he just told me evolution works. I've never seen it. So if I'm going to believe that, you're going to have to show it to me. And I thought, either I know something the biologists know, or they know something I don't know. And I got really curious. I thought, if evolution is true, or if this works anything like they're telling me, then there's a whole bunch of engineering nobody ever taught me in school. And guess what? There was a whole bunch of engineering that nobody had taught me in school. But you know what's funny? The biologists hadn't been taught that in school either.
Mm-hmm.
They had been, a story had been rammed down their throat and drilled into their head that they believed simply because it was repeated so many times. And the personalities come into play. If you pay attention, everybody knows that accountants tend to be people of a certain personality type, and lawyers tend to be people of a certain and engineers, well, biologists and engineers are wildly different animals, and they ask completely different questions. And I said, so this kind of gets into theological beliefs. I believe there is one world that operates on one set of principles that is ruled by one divine creator. And it's not a subset of all these separate little cubby holes that don't have anything to do with each other, that there's a unity to the whole thing. So a biologist ought to be able to explain to an engineer how an eye gets engineered, and they shouldn't have to skip over like a whole bunch of steps and say, oh, just believe us, we're the experts. And I'm also a marketer. And when people start getting huffy and defensive and shrill and strident and start calling you names when you start asking a bunch of questions, it means they might not know what they're talking about, and they feel threatened because you're challenging their authority. And so I started seeing all of these things, and I had no idea how fascinating this was going to get. First, I need to be very clear about something. So you referred to the story with my brother. So I'm a pastor. We grew up Protestant Christians in a very conservative community. We were taught that the world was made in 7 literal days, and we believed all these things when we were kids, and we grew up, and I became a business guy, and my brother was a missionary in China, and I went to see him, and he said, Perry, I'm done being a Christian. I don't believe any of this stuff anymore, and I'm moving home next month. And I'm like, what? And we got into an argument, and I said, Brian, look at the hand at the end of your arm. This is a nice piece of engineering. You don't think this is an accumulation of random accidents, do you? Hold on. All you need is mutations and selection, and you're going to get a hand. And I thought, I know what natural selection is. It's like playoffs in a basketball game. Like, okay, the winner wins and the loser loses. That doesn't explain how you get a hand. You haven't explained anything. Mm-hmm. And at a point in this argument, I decided I'm going to stop arguing with him. We're not getting anywhere. We're just getting deeper into conflict. I'm going to stop arguing. I'm going to go home and I'm going to figure this out, because you know what? I really want to know. Now, this conversation had actually already been going on for 1.5 years. He had just leaped way farther than I ever thought. Now, you're part of a Muslim organization. You very well know how religious and theological arguments are. You know how threatening it can feel when somebody challenges your belief system. And my brother is very smart. He is really smart. And he is much better at asking penetrating questions than most people. And he was asking very penetrating questions. Mm-hmm. He was dragging me further into intellectual territory and into doubt and into questions than I had ever been. And I was feeling very uncomfortable. And so when I got home, I sat down, I started buying books like crazy. And as the books came in, I thought, I've been raised by theologians, and theology is squishy. There's a lot of ways to interpret a Garden of Eden story, or a Cain and Abel story, or a Noah and the Ark. Like, you know this, I know this.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of ways to interpret Newton's law, Ohm's law. I'm going to let science make this decision for me. Is there purpose behind the hand at the end of my arm, or is this really just billiard balls banging around in the universe? I am an engineer, and I am going to figure this out. Mm-hmm. And if it makes me an atheist, that scares me to death, because I have a wife and I have a family and I have kids and I read them stories at night and we go to church, and this could rip my entire life to. I've watched people do this, and so have you. Like, people go, I don't believe in faith anymore. And then all of their faith friends are like, well, I'm not sure if maybe I'm not going to be as friendly with you as I used to be. And maybe my guard's going to be up. And maybe I'm a little nervous about you. And maybe you're an infidel. And maybe you're a heretic. And I'm like, you know what? I want to know. And so be it. And if this turns me an atheist, or this turns me to some other religion or whatever, I'm going to do it. This scares me to death. I don't know what arguments I'm going to have with my wife. I don't know if, are we going to go to Thanksgiving dinner and everybody's going to pray, and Brian and I are going to look at each other and smirk and go, oh, these silly people, praying to their invisible daddy in the sky. Here we go. I'm going to find out. And, you asked me earlier, why don't people challenge things? Is, well, when push comes to shove, it's like they kind of like their families and their communities and their businesses and their churches and their mosques to be intact. And they kind of like things the way they are, and they don't want to upset the apple cart. And so I said, I'm going into this thing. Now, there's another, and I said, if science makes me an atheist, then I guess I'm going to be an atheist. And that scared me too. And I want to explain why. I don't know you, Sabor, but I can tell you're a scholarly guy. I can tell by the way you talk, the way you dress. I can tell by the library behind you. I looked at you guys' website. You're a thinker. And so you probably know what I'm about to tell you. I knew from studying history that in the late 1800s, Nietzsche, who's a famous atheist, he said, we've killed God and the blood is on our hands, and there's not enough towels to mop it up. And he said, in quite a few different ways, he said, when we get rid of God, we're starting over with Western civilization. And it's terrifying what can happen. And he predicted what happened in Russia in the Bolshevik Revolution. And he predicted what happened with Stalin. And he predicted what happened with Hitler and Mao. And atheist governments killed more people in 1 century than all religious wars in all centuries combined. Most people don't know this. Something like 50 to 100 million people lost their lives under atheist regimes. And it had a lot to do with getting rid of God, because what they did was they got rid of the notion that humans are made in a divine image. Yeah. Because the Genesis story, which at least in some sense, Muslims, Jews, and Christians all believe, it says God made man in his image. And Nietzsche said, well, you just pulled the rug out from under that. So we're going to have to figure it all out, all from scratch. And it's going to be bloody and it's going to be messy. And he was right. And this scared me, because not only was I scared about my family and my relationships and my church friends and all of that, I was also scared at a societal level, because up to this point, I was like, well, Nietzsche was wrong. He was obviously wrong. God exists. The hand at my arm tells me that. I don't even have to know much about evolution, or I don't really care about evolution. It's purposeful. And I had to decide, dude, you have to be willing. if you really care about the truth, you have to be willing to push a big reset button on all of it. So I had a major existential crisis, and it was terrifying.
I can imagine. And just on that point, Perry, you've it's not just a case where you decided to, okay, I need to understand this for my own peace of mind and just to speak to my own family, but also it became for you a type of um, a type of a pathway on which you wanted to get as deep into the rabbit hole as possible. And I think what started to happen at that point is you started to find, well, there's other people who have already thought about challenging neo-Darwinism in the way that you're actually thinking. So before we get into that, I wanted to highlight something which, because one of the things, Perry, I want to be very direct with you. You know about marketing, you know about purple cows, right? About doing something unique. I didn't want to ask you, Perry, questions which have been asked already. Because I feel that I'm kind of wasting your time. So I wanted to ask you questions which for me are very important, and I'm sure for anybody who understands the importance of the things that you've uncovered. So this is one of the papers that you've written, Progress in Biophysics and Molecular Biology. Biology transcends the limits of computation. Now, everybody in this particular arena is aware of the famous debate between Richard Dawkins and Dennis Noble when it came to, the Hay Festival here in the UK. And what I wanted to do is, I'm sure you've seen that debate. I'm sure you're friends with Dennis Noble, so you know what his thoughts are on reductionism and, process ontology. I wanted your thoughts on how this particular paper would impact the discussions on process ontology versus substance ontology.
That's a great question. So gold star for you for that's a great question. So in that paper, I break the world into, I said there are 3 categories of cause and effect: chemicals, codes, and cognition. And I draw a clear line between them. So 3 C's, chemicals, means the laws of physics that you read in any physics book, the laws of chemistry that you read in any chemistry book, particularly Newtonian, and it is literally billiard balls banging around, action and reaction. And that level of physics and chemistry seems to be very well understood and is kind of an exact science. And as far as I know, if you go outside of the Earth if you went to some dead planet where there's no life, the laws of physics and chemistry would appear to explain everything that you would see. And it's all you need, as far as I know. And that's the case I make in the paper. Then there is another level, which is completely different from that. And that's the level of language and symbols and logic. It's ones and zeros going across. It's the world of codes, which is the subject of my $10 million prize. I thought very, 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 very hard about what a code is and what a code is not in order to write a specification for a $10 million prize where I had investors that if my specification is wrong, they can lose $10 million and get nothing for it. And I'm in a world of hot water and discomfort with my career and my investors who are counting on me to know what I'm talking about. And what the $10 million prize says is that communication and symbolic codes and languages operate at a completely different plane than the laws of physics and chemistry, because right now on the spot, we can make up an acronym, SPC, Sabor's Podcast. And we just and if we decide from now on that every time we say SBC, we're talking about your podcast, we just invented a term out of thin air and decided to assign meaning to it. And this is how every word in every language and every alphabet is. You can't derive it from the laws of physics and chemistry that we decided to make that connection. We could call it anything we wanted. We could call it System 7125.
Mm-hmm.
So language is arbitrary and involves choices and symbols, and it operates at a completely different plane than physics and chemistry. Well, then I further defined cognition as the conscious ability to make those choices. And I pointed out that only life has cognition or creates codes. And I have a $10 million prize to prove it. And what we're looking for is the unknown laws of the universe that connect those three levels. We do not know how those three levels are interconnected, but they are somehow. So you said process ontology. What you mean by that word, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, is there is such a thing as a process, and it exists as an abstraction. If I have a map, if I have a piece of paper that says, here's how to go from Perry's house in Chicago to Sabor's house in the UK, and here's all the streets you drive on, and here's what plane you get on, and here's what you, that's a process. Process ontology says, when you draw that map to get your house and you give it to me, it comes into existence, and there it is an abstract set of ideas that tells you how to do something that you could have done a whole bunch of other ways. Am I right?
Yep. Yeah, that's the right description of it.
Processes exist. Now, if you have a material notion of the world and you believe that it's just billiard balls and it's just laws of physics and chemistry, you have a very hard time explaining how a process can come into existence, because you end up saying something like, well, I guess because of the peculiarities of the Big Bang, Sabor just must have had no choice but to write the map that exact way, because choices don't really exist. And it disintegrates into nonsense. Like, are you going to sit here and tell me that when you ordered that sandwich, that you didn't really order a sandwich, that the laws of physics and chemistry ordered that sandwich for you? Like, are you crazy? There's atheist philosophers that believe nonsense like this. It doesn't make any sense. And the way you know it makes any sense is nobody acts as though it's true. I mean, they might pound the table and tell you it's true. They never act like it's true. And they sure as heck hate you when you treat them like it's true. Oh, you don't believe that. The laws of physics and chemistry just dictated that you would believe that. You didn't decide to be an atheist. You didn't use your own rationality. You were just forced by the blind force of the universe to say what you just said. That's crazy.
Absolutely. I really love the way that you put that. And since you touched upon the topic of consciousness, I was thinking of, I mean, here's another question which I wanted to put to you, because again, like I said, I want to get something out of you which you haven't covered on other channels. I had on this channel a few weeks ago Rosenberg, and obviously he believes the physical facts fix all the facts, and he believes that consciousness is simply the brain at work. Mind is, he believes that there is no hard problem from that perspective. It can be fixed, it can be explained, it can be, science can put a light on it. And then Roos, Michael Roos, he doesn't believe science can actually do that. And you know, you've shared your thoughts about consciousness and you know, your sort of perspective on it. Why do you think some naturalists, because obviously Roos is a naturalist and so is Rosenberg, why do you think some of them are pessimistic that we won't be able to explain consciousness, and others believe we can? And do you think that that attitude is related to their ontology, whether they believe in things being reduced down from a matter perspective, or whether they believe in a type of process ontology? Do you think that's why they have different perspectives on these things?
So I think that there is a large class of atheists whose starting fundamental assumption about everything is that it's purposeless.
Mm.
That is like the first brick in the entire building. It's random, it's purposeless. We get to do whatever we want. There is no higher level order or structure. It's really, in my opinion, a moral position that they have staked out from the beginning. There's no God judging me. There's no guy in the sky watching what I'm doing. There is no afterlife. There is no plan. It just, the billiard balls bang around in the universe and it happens the way that it happens. And that belief system gives you certain rationalizations and certain permissions and a certain way of living your life that some people prefer. Well, and if you can just take all of the laws of physics and the fine-tuning of the universe for granted somehow, I don't know how you do that, but a lot of people do. And you can say, well, I don't really know, but consciousness just kind of bubbled out from this somewhere. And I don't, why do we want to bother trying to answer that question? Then they don't have to trifle with this notion of purpose. But if consciousness comes first, then all the hundreds of years of science has not gotten rid of God at all. It has not swept any of these questions under the rug. It's not answered any of these questions. And we're really no further to an answer than we were 500 or 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. And if you study the history of consciousness and all the arguments that have had about it, going back to the Greeks and the Romans, these are very old questions and they really haven't changed much at all.
Yeah.
Furthermore, one more thing.
Sure.
If you haven't read enough philosophy, enough theology, enough poetry, if you live in a science book bubble, you might just think that's all there is.
Yeah.
But if you've read a lot of literature, if you've read a lot of poetry, if you've been raised in any religious tradition and actually have been educated in the finer points of it, whether you're a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Muslim or a Jew or a Christian or a Mormon or you name it, your brain is too big to just dismiss all of those questions and call them nonsense. There's no way you can just shrug all that off. So sorry to interrupt you, but maybe we can.
No, I really loved your passion and what you were speaking about here. Now I wanted to put something else to you. And this is something which I believe you said a few years ago, which hasn't panned out. And I wanted your thoughts on this. So a few years ago, you made the prediction, which is quite reasonable. It's a very reasonable prediction, which is right after the 2016 Royal Society meeting, which you attended, New Trends in Evolutionary Biology. We all know the importance of that meeting. Mm-hmm. One of the predictions that you made, I think just after the meeting, maybe a month later, I watch all your stuff, so I know the rough dates. One of the predictions you made is that in the past, obviously changes in terms of where academics decide, okay, do you know what, this thing's not working, we have a new paradigm or a new challenge, and then the textbooks change. You said, well, it normally takes a lot of time for academia to trickle down to the textbook level, and things are out of date. Everyone knows they're out of date. And the prediction that you made is, well, now we have social media, now we have a lot more, it's information age, so this change is going to be much quicker. And I wanted to challenge that a bit, because that the assumption that you had there is that there's almost like perfect flow of information where people want those changes to happen. I just when I was interviewing Professor James Shapiro, he told me that his book was actually taken out of print, and that's one of the reasons why he went for the second version. And the other thing which I wanted to remind you of and remind myself of is that McClintock was dismissed for decades, right? And the very fact that she won the Nobel Prize, which she should have won 30 years earlier, the barriers that she faced, the barriers that Lynn Margulis faced, the barriers which even now Dennis Noble is facing, I don't think you took those barriers into account when you made your prediction that the textbooks are going to change that rapidly.
So I would say I was half right. So let's start with let's give you credit for what you just said. Most industries, speaking as a business consultant and a marketer and science and cancer and all the rest, most industries are 50 years behind state of the art. Like not 10, like 50. Pick any field of medicine, pick and maybe technology and the internet, maybe that's only 10 years behind state of the art, but still. And so most biology textbooks, when they talk about evolution, are 50 years behind what we actually know. And there is a lot of inertia. So there's a large sense in which you are right, Sabur. However, I can also say this. After the Royal Society meeting, the atmosphere in evolutionary biology changed a lot, and it changed quickly, because before that meeting, anybody that came out and they had an alternate view of evolution, they got their hands slapped very quickly by a very predictable cabal of bullies.
Yeah.
Jerry Coyne, P.Z. Myers, Richard Dawkins, and all of their guys, they would come out and they would mercilessly attack. After the Royal Society meeting, that stopped happening. And I happen to know, because I know a lot of inside baseball, that those guys turned down a whole bunch of opportunities to have debates and discussions, and they went silent. Really, the only person who even tries to talk about this and defend the old view anymore is Jerry Coyne. And he's off on his blog, and he's retired, and only certain people read that, and he's really not that influential anymore.
Yeah.
If you paid attention to that debate with Richard Dawkins and Dennis Noble, Dennis mopped the floor very politely. He demolished Dawkins with a bow tie and flourish, and hardly anybody noticed, because he was so nice about it. Nobody is willing to defend the old view. So yes, there's a huge amount of inertia, but there is definitely spring flowers blooming. And I'll give you an example of this. James Shapiro asked me to help him and two other guys organize the Cancer and Evolution Symposium 4 years ago.
Okay. So can I just...
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, 1 second. That was literally what I was just about to mention. Right, literally. And the reason why I wanted to mention that is because 1 in 2 people here in the UK are going to get cancer eventually, right? Yeah. And the understanding of cancer in terms of how it evolves in the processual way, it totally changes the way that we view cancer. And I believe the work that you're doing with the Evolution and Cancer Group, that will have a greater impact than any debate that Dawkins and Dennis Noble, because it's practically showing this is what happens when you take a processual view.
Yes. Yes, yes, yes. So let me backfill you on this. So would you help? Yes, absolutely. I'm in. And we started putting this together. And we ended up doing 30 speakers, 300 people in attendance, a whole bunch of cancer researchers, all kinds of fields of science. It was a wonderful success. It has grown into an organization of 5,300 members of the American Association of Cancer Research. Well, here's a little story. Henry Hang sent James Shapiro a paper by Jin-Song Liu that explains how cancer starts when cells do a symbiotic merger, just like Lynn Margulis taught about symbiogenesis. Said an organ cell, like a kidney cell, does a merger with like a white blood cell. And they form a composite merger acquisition new creature. It eventually starts spilling out cancer cells. And Jin-Song Liu explained he had done his homework. He's a pathologist at MD Anderson, and he'd been studying this for 20 years. And he said, this is a high-speed evolutionary event. The pre-cancer cell now takes in hundreds of signals from the environment and adapts to them. He explains how all of Barbara McClintock's work describes the evolution and adaptation of that cancer, that pre-cancer cell, and then how tumors form and how they evolve at hyperspeed, causing cancer. And James Shapiro flipped out. Now, Jim does not flip out. He is but he was like, this is genius. That was 4 years ago. Here's what has happened since. The first conference on hybrid giant cells was held at MD Anderson in February. 100 people were there. We now know how to detect cancer at stage -1. Azra Raza at Columbia University has a patented method of painting a red bullseye on those cells, and they are now doing experimental experiments on how to take those cells out. We are not far from a stage -1 diagnostic test that your doctor could order for you for $1,500. And we have a group of cancer researchers that have completely broken away from the standard definitions of cancer and the standard treatments of cancer, which do not work. And everybody knows they don't work because everybody's got a sister-in-law who's dead, whose treatments were going really well 5 months earlier, right? People really care about cancer. And I could go to a wedding and I could sit down to somebody and I could get into a conversation with anybody anywhere. I could, on a bus in London. And if we got into a conversation about that, we're not talking about Darwinian evolution theory. We're talking about real human beings. We're talking about real health issues. We're talking about being able to solve the world's #2 disease for 1/10 the cost and 1/10 the pain, maybe 1/100th the pain and suffering of the current stage 4 chemotherapy and all of that. So this is a very big deal. So
absolutely,
this is such an exciting place to be in the world. I can really contain myself.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as somebody who lost someone recently to cancer, I can tell you that people are going to notice. People are going to notice that, wait a minute, the very treatment that we give to cancer helps cancer cells, which are cognitive, which are intelligent, which are conscious, to a level to adapt. And this is why I love the way that you put it in your last podcast that I was listening to, is that's why cancer treatment is going so well. And 4 months later, the person's dead, because we've actually created the ability for those cells to hypermutate. And again, this goes back to, that's not a neo-Darwinian process.
No, no. The reason that we are made so much progress was we rejected the Darwinian notion of slow, gradual evolution driven by mutations. And we said it's cognitive, it's high speed, it's incredibly smart, and it can happen in minutes or hours, not eons, and it's driven by intelligence, not natural selection. And now the question is, how do you convince a stressed out cell or a stressed out precancer or even cancer cell to go back to doing its old job and back to its old identity? It's really a question of identity, which is a very philosophical question. So this is the kind of question that your average molecular biologist is very uncomfortable with. But the average person who reads poetry and reads theology, reads philosophy, reads literature, listens to music, they're like, I get it. This totally makes sense. There's got to be a way to calm those cells down. Of course there are. Of course there is. Absolutely. But it's going to change. It's going to change the way that we think about how we deal with our problems.
It's going to be a game changer, and this is going to give more. I guess it's going to give more credit to the likes of McClintock, who discovered processes that are really not highlighted enough. I mean, one of the things I love that you said, and again, this is to do with intellectual bravery. You said, well, you consider her to be, more important potentially than Darwin.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of people are bridle at that. But look, let's stick with it. Today's cancer revolution, and I truly believe what you guys are working on is revolutionary, is because of what she discovered about mobile transposable elements.
Yes.
It's not because of Darwin.
Darwin, first of all, I like Charles Darwin. I think he's a good guy. A lot of people hate him. A lot of Christians hate him. Oh, that bad guy. Listen, he's been bastardized and misrepresented by a whole bunch of people who have some really bad agendas. If you go back to the actual person, I give him credit. But all he did was open. Darwin came up with about 5 answers and about 500 new questions. Darwin only raised a huge number of new questions that nobody had any idea how to deal with. Okay, you discover natural selection. Well, you've only scratched the scratch on the surface. You haven't really explained anything. Barbara McClintock was the first evolutionary biologist to really start to explain what was happening at a molecular biology level when a real-time evolutionary event occurs, and she understood what actually happened. It's absolutely remarkable. And she was ignored for decades. And even now, people don't really realize the size of contribution she made. She won a Nobel Prize, but her significance of her work is really more like 10 Nobel Prizes. It's a complete game changer.
Absolutely. And just to key off something you said about Darwin, I want to highlight for the viewers who are interested in his thoughts. There's a book by Nick Spencer called Darwin and God. It shows that Darwin was not a militant atheist. He actually respected believers. He was working with Asa Gray, who was a Christian. Darwin definitely was misrepresented, and I don't think Dennis Noble says this, he wouldn't have agreed with neo-Darwinism, and also he definitely wouldn't have agreed with new atheism. Now, going back to cancer and this issue that we're all going to be facing at some point, what we know now is we have to look at biology from a different perspective. The actual paradigm is totally different. It is a totally different of way of looking at life. What research areas would you recommend in the future for researchers to publish papers on? I mean, this particular paper is not something I thought I would see from you, because I've been following your work for many, many years. But I mean, this is obviously needed, and this is a part of the dialogue, the discussion between process ontology and substance ontology. But what areas would you like new researchers to focus on to facilitate the furthering of the cures against cancer?
Well, as we wrap this up, let me give you an experiment that I am astonished hasn't been done.
Okay.
And I'm actually actively looking for a way to get the experiment done. I've been talking to scientists about this, and if somebody has the ability to do this, then get in touch with my office, and we'll see what we can do. So we have known for 200 years that the particle wave experiment in quantum physics, that a human observer can get a wave if they're looking for a wave, get a particle if they're looking for a particle, and it depends on the observer. And the experiment will even change, like, whether the particle detector is plugged or unplugged or not will affect the experiment. So everybody knows humans can collapse a wave function, as the terminology says. You know what experiment nobody's done? Can a dog, cat, mouse, dragonfly, mosquito, bacteria, yeast, prokaryote, eukaryote, can animals collapse a wave function? That experiment hasn't been done.
Okay.
What does this have to do with cancer? I believe that the onset of cancer is a decision of, let's say, a kidney cell or a pancreas cell or a liver cell that says, I want to get out of here.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like it here anymore. Get me out. It doesn't have any way to get out until a white blood cell comes along. Hey, you got one of those propeller things. I like you. I'll give you immortality and you give me a taxi ride into the bloodstream, and off they go. And that's how giant precancer cells form. It is the cognitive ability of a cell to make an autonomous decision instead of obeying orders that is at the root of all of this. I believe, this is my hypothesis, I could be wrong, and these experiments will shed lots of light on this, but I believe that all living things have a degree of an autonomy. They have the ability to just be another skin cell doing the job like all of its neighbors, or, hey, I think I'm going to be a cancer skin cell, and I'm going to be a freelancer, and I'm going to hang out my shingle, and I'm going to get my own resources. And this is a quantum phenomenon. And it has everything to do with the dotted line between living and non-living things. So that's where I would start.
Wow. That's quite heavy. That's gonna take me some time to process. I'm gonna go back and listen to this a bit more carefully. So Perry, is wonderful speaking to you. I wanted to, like I said, I like doing things differently. So rather than asking you what you're working on, I wanted to recommend something as well. You said something that got me thinking. In one of your interviews, you said living things don't just obey mathematics, they create mathematics.
Yes.
And so on this, I wanted to recommend if you could work on a book, because what you said with that statement is something interesting. We know that the reductive ideas start with biology to chemistry to physics to mathematics. But by saying that statement, you're showing a feedback, a feedback loop in terms of the organism creating the mathematics. So I think that, a title of something like Create Not Obey, the way of the living organism. Well, you're the marketing guy, you know how to market it, right? I would love to see something like that, because it's been a while since you've published, and I know you've been very busy, but I'd love a new publication from you in the coming years.
Well, thank you. And you know what you can do is, if you go to evo2.org and click on the blog, any blog post that's on our website, just above the add a comment, there's a link to an Evolution 2.0 GPT.
Hmm.
It's a little AI engine, and it's loaded up with all of my papers and the Evolution 2.0 book and a lot of my blog posts, and you can ask it questions, and it gives you not perfect but reasonably decent answers. And my first suggestion, if you think this is interesting, go ask, like, go open the GPT and ask a question like, why do you think cells are self-aware? Or why do you think a cancer cell is making some kind of a decision? And it will, or what do you think evolution has to do with quantum mechanics? And it will tell you the content of those papers in plain English. In the last 3 years, I haven't published any biology books, but I've published 3 scientific papers, one on viruses, and then the 2 other papers that we've talked about. And they have very profound implications for what life is and where it goes. And I would encourage people, you can use the chat bot, and whatever answers, you can post comments on the blog, and I'll respond to them. I would love for people to start exploring this yourself. There is a growing field called basal cognition, and it's the study of what are the cognitive abilities of organisms that don't even have nervous systems. You get slime molds and bacteria. They're incredibly smart. If you think you have to have a nervous system to be smart, wrong. So you've asked me some of the best questions anybody's ever asked me on a podcast interview. And this has just been fabulous. I've enjoyed every minute of it. In fact, I'd go longer, but my daughter's waiting for us to go out. So we're wrapping up. This has been
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we were supposed to have 45 minutes. You gave me an hour. I'm honored. So thank you so much, Perry. And hopefully I can have you back in a few months, or maybe next year, when a few more things have been developed in terms of what you're working on. Is there any last message you want to give the viewers about where they can follow your work, or what you're particularly working on at the moment?
Well, I would love for people to subscribe to the Evolution 2.0 podcast. It's on YouTube. It's on all the podcast streaming things. If you go to evo2.org and you scroll to the bottom of the front page, there's a sign up, and you can get on our email list, and we'll start sending you fascinating updates. I'm telling you, we are in a huge, massive uptick in evolutionary biology. The field is changing rapidly. There's a freedom of speech that did not exist 5 years ago. There's all kinds of fascinating research. I try to keep up with it. I blog about it. I go through my blog. There are so many interesting things, so many rabbit holes, so many interesting people. It's a great time to be alive. And so I realize, the world's in chaos and there's all kinds of problems. Let me tell you what, there's a lot of good things happening in the world, and please don't forget it.
Absolutely. What a wonderful message to end on. Thank you so much, Perry. It's been an honor.
Thank you.